What happens when a man, who gave nearly 3 decades to serving his country, is told he doesn't belong in his own home? Dorian Ree was about to find out that sometimes peace isn't just earned, it's challenged. Picture this. You're unwinding by your own pool when suddenly someone calls security because they assume you don't belong. How would you react? That rare moment when you finally believe you can breathe easy, no noise, no trouble, just pure calm. That's exactly where Dorian Ree believed he was. Until, of course, everything flipped upside down. It was a golden Saturday afternoon in Scottsdale, Arizona, the kind where the sun kisses the earth and the sky looks like a painter's dream. Dorian, a fit man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair, had just completed a few relaxed laps in the private pool of Sandalwood Estates, a gated community he recently joined after retiring from a high-pressure 28-year career as a Navy SEAL admiral. He adored his new surroundings, palm-lined streets, distant mountains, and a sense of safety he'd missed for years. This pool was his sanctuary. Dressed in a plain black swim shirt and trunks, Dorian grabbed a towel, sank into a lounger, and closed his eyes, soaking in the gentle heat. His worn duffel, still bearing faded military patches, rested beside him. He wasn't drawing attention. He wasn't disturbing anyone. But sometimes peace alone isn't enough. That's when he heard it. The sharp tap of heels on the pool deck, followed by a voice that immediately made his instincts spike. "Excuse me? Excuse me, sir?" Dorian squinted against the sunlight. Before him stood a woman he didn't recognize. Mid-40s, short blonde hair styled perfectly, oversized designer sunglasses, and a chic beach bag slung over one shoulder. Her name, he'd later learn, was Charlene Davenport. Initially, Dorian assumed she'd make small talk, maybe ask for directions or comment on the weather. "You can't be here," Charlene snapped, folding her arms tightly. "This pool is for residents only. Guests must be with a homeowner. No greeting, no inquiry. Just a blunt accusation dressed as a rule." Dorian stayed calm, every fiber of his Navy training holding him steady. He sensed this wouldn't be a quick fix. "I live here," Dorian said, voice firm yet respectful. "Bought a place on Mariposa Drive. Moved in last month." He even offered a small smile, trying to diffuse the brewing storm. Charlene, unmoved, studied him with suspicion, as if reality didn't fit her expectations. "I don't think so," she said, her voice rising. "I know every resident here. You're not one of them." Dorian's polite smile vanished. He wasn't in the mood to justify his existence, but knew better than to lose his cool. Not here. Not now. "I'm Dorian Ree," he said, rising to his feet and brushing water off his arms. "Unit 14B. When standing your ground feels like a crime, how do you prove you belong without losing your dignity?" Dorian Ree was about to find out, not with anger, but with unshakable calm. "Feel free to check with the property office if you'd like," Dorian offered, but Charlene wasn't searching for facts. She was hunting for control. She stepped back, rummaging through her designer bag, pulling out her phone with trembling fingers. "You have 2 minutes to leave before I call security," she barked. "You're trespassing." Dorian glanced around the empty pool deck. Only the faint hum of a landscaper's trimmer floated through the air. His stomach sank. She wasn't bluffing. Still, Dorian decided he wasn't budging, and that's when things spiraled. Charlene's thumb hovered over her screen, her body radiating hostility. Dorian remained calm, arms casually folded across his chest. He wasn't itching for trouble. He simply had no reason to leave. "Call whoever you need," he said quietly but firmly. "I'm not leaving my own pool." The words lit Charlene's anger even hotter. "You're making this harder than necessary," she hissed. "If you had any decency, you'd walk away." Dorian's eyes narrowed slightly, but he kept his stance easy. He already knew. Raise his voice and he'd be seen as aggressive. Stand his ground and he'd be labeled a threat, a no-win trap. Charlene slammed her finger down, activating speakerphone. "Yes, I need security at the community pool," she said sharply. "There's a man here who won't leave. I think he's dangerous." Dangerous. The word slapped the air. Dorian didn't flinch. Years of service had taught him how to stay steady when others tried to rewrite reality. "Help's on the way," Charlene said, smug now, lowering her phone like she'd won a battle. "You might want to start packing your things." Dorian didn't move. Instead, he studied her, reading what was clear. This wasn't about fear. It was about entitlement, about assumptions written long before she'd even spoken to him. An older man in jogging shorts and a baseball cap wandered onto the deck, towel under his arm. He paused, sensing the tension. "Everything okay here?" the jogger asked, glancing between Dorian and Charlene. Charlene immediately pounced. "There's an intruder. I'm waiting for security." The jogger looked at Dorian, then back to her, uncertainty flickering across his face. "You sure about that?" he asked slowly. "I'm sure," Charlene snapped. "He doesn't belong." Dorian caught the jogger's gaze and gave a slight, silent nod, a quiet plea for patience. Nearby, a woman with a yoga mat slung over her shoulder froze inside the gate, feeling the heavy charge in the air. Like a ripple in still water, the whole community was being drawn in. And still, Dorian stood silent, calm as a slow river, waiting for truth to catch up. Minutes later, a white golf cart buzzed into view. 2 security officers climbed out, one speaking quickly into a radio. Charlene nearly sprinted toward them, pointing at Dorian like she'd spotted a wild animal. "That's him! That's the man I was telling you about." The lead officer, a short woman with sharp brown eyes, raised a hand. "All right, ma'am, slow down. We'll handle it." The officers approached Dorian, steady but non-threatening. "Sir, can we get your name and unit number?" the officer asked. "Dorian Ree, 14B, he said calmly. "Bought it about a month ago. Feel free to check." Behind them, Charlene huffed, muttering about rules and liars. The second officer, younger and alert, pulled a tablet and tapped into the resident database. Meanwhile, the crowd around the pool thickened. Teenagers with towels over their shoulders, a mother balancing a toddler, an elderly woman adjusting her sun hat, all watching, whispering, the tension thick as storm clouds. You could slice the tension with a knife. The lead officer's radio crackled to life. She listened briefly, then turned toward Charlene. "Ma'am, Mr. Ree is a registered homeowner," she said evenly. "Everything checks out." Charlene blinked, stunned. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. He's a resident?" she finally croaked. "Yes, ma'am," the officer confirmed, polite but unmistakably firm. "He's fully authorized to be here." Instead of apologizing, Charlene's face twisted in frustration, like reality itself had betrayed her. And that's when the real cracks started to show. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at the officers like she couldn't comprehend the truth. Around her, the crowd grew braver, whispers rising louder, glances darting between her and Dorian as they pieced the situation together. Meanwhile, Dorian stayed rooted, arms relaxed. No smugness, no smirk, just quiet endurance. Charlene snapped back into motion, puffing herself up as if indignation could erase the last 5 minutes. "Well, how was I supposed to know?" she barked for everyone to hear. "He doesn't look like he lives here." The words hung heavy in the air. Someone gasped. Another muttered under their breath. "Are you serious?" Dorian didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head slightly, almost inviting her to reconsider before she dug herself deeper. But Charlene wasn't retreating. She crossed her arms even tighter and turned back to the officers. "Are you sure your system isn't wrong?" she demanded. "Maybe he used someone else's name. It happens all the time. Trying to sound helpful, trying to frame herself as the vigilant neighbor. The older jogger from earlier stepped forward, towel still draped over his shoulder. "Charlene, stop," he said quietly, voice weary. "You're embarrassing yourself. You're wrong. Let it go." Charlene whipped around, her face flushed red. "You don't know what you're talking about, Greg," she snapped. Greg just shook his head, clearly finished with her nonsense. Meanwhile, the officer quietly spoke into her radio again, likely double-checking Dorian's residency. Not because they doubted him, but because process demanded it. By the fence, a teenager whispered to his friend, "Man, this is messed up," and his buddy simply nodded, staring at Charlene like she was something alien. Finally, Dorian spoke, his voice calm but cutting through the heavy air. "You didn't ask who I was. You decided what I was." Charlene opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "You decided I didn't belong the second you looked at me," Dorian continued. "And you called for backup, like I was some threat that needed fixing." His words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried a truth so heavy it didn't require shouting. Charlene fidgeted with her sunglasses, slipping them on and off, eyes darting nervously. She finally seemed to notice the crowd now fully watching, fully judging. "You know," Dorian said, stepping forward just slightly, "you could have spared yourself all this, if you just asked a simple question first." Charlene tried to salvage her dignity with a stiff shrug. "I was just trying to protect the community," she mumbled. The woman with the yoga mat rolled her eyes so hard it was almost audible. "Protect us from what, Charlene?" she said, her voice dry as sand. Near the pool, a man sitting quietly shook his head in silent disbelief. Charlene didn't answer. She just clutched her beach bag tighter, her posture rigid, like a statue that didn't want to be seen anymore. The lid officer cleared her throat diplomatically. "Everything's settled now," she said. "Everyone's welcome to enjoy the amenities, as long as we respect one another." But the spell had broken. The cheerful, sunny afternoon had been tainted, the warmth replaced by a thick, invisible chill. Dorian turned slowly, his steps deliberate, carrying the quiet weight of a man who had nothing left to prove. Dorian picked up his towel slowly, unrushed and unshaken. If anything, he seemed stronger now, like he'd shed every doubt anyone tried to throw at him. He slung the towel over his shoulder and gave Charlene one final look. "Next time, maybe start with a hello," he said, voice steady. "Could save you a lot of trouble." Then he turned, walked back to his chair, and sank into it with the calm ease of a man who, in that moment, owned the world. As the officers packed up and the crowd began to drift away, the air still buzzed with whispers. It was clear. Charlene's real consequences were only just beginning. She didn't leave right away. Instead, she hovered awkwardly by the gate, fidgeting with her bag, pretending to be busy on her phone, fooling no one. The murmurs grew sharper, slicing the heavy afternoon air like tiny knives. Greg, the jogger, settled into the lounger next to Dorian's, offering only a small nod of respect, the kind that didn't need words. The young mom gave Dorian a soft, grateful smile as she passed. Even the teenagers tossed him glances, part apology, part awe. Charlene, meanwhile, lingered like she was hoping the story might somehow rewrite itself. And then Gloria Bennett arrived. Tough, no nonsense, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her head, she marched through the gate, clipboard in hand. She wore her authority like armor and looked less than pleased. Charlene immediately straightened up, smoothing her hair, ready for reinforcements. But Gloria made a beeline straight for Dorian. "Mr. Rhee," she said crisply. Dorian rose to meet her. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "Apologies for the disruption," Gloria said. "We've confirmed your residency. I personally want to welcome you to Sandalwood Estates." She extended her hand. Dorian shook it firmly. "Thank you," he said simply. Charlene's mouth fell open. Then Gloria turned to her, tucking the clipboard tight under one arm. "And you, Miss Davenport," her tone sharpening, "we'll be reviewing your behavior today under our community guidelines for harassment." The word hit like a slap. "Harassment?" Charlene gasped. "Yes," Gloria said flatly. "Targeting another resident without cause, disrupting community peace, filing a false report, all serious violations." Around the pool, people pretended not to listen, but every ear was tuned in. Charlene flushed deep pink, stammering for an excuse that refused to come. I was just trying to be cautious," she sputtered. "I thought he was, you know." She trailed off, realizing anything she said would only dig the hole deeper. Dorian stayed silent. He didn't need to say a thing. The truth had already settled thick in the air. But Gloria wasn't finished. "Mr. Rhee served our country for nearly 3 decades, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "A retired Navy SEAL admiral, with honors." A collective gasp rippled through the poolside. Even Charlene looked stunned, the ground crumbling under the weight of her assumptions. Dorian gave a small, almost amused shake of his head. "I'm just here to enjoy the pool," he said casually. "Same as anyone else." The teenagers exchanged wide-eyed looks. One muttered, "Dude's a SEAL. That's crazy," half in awe. Greg chuckled under his breath and leaned toward Dorian. "Guess they don't teach common sense in real estate classes," he joked. Dorian allowed himself a small smile. Charlene, meanwhile, shrank inward, clutching her bag like a lifeline. Gloria made another sharp note on her clipboard. "We'll be in touch, Miss Davenport," she said coolly. "In the meantime, I suggest you reflect on how you treat your neighbors." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and strode toward the office, security officers trailing behind. Charlene stood frozen by the gate, her earlier fire long gone, left with nothing but 100 silent stares burning into her. Even as the scene dissolved and people returned to their sun chairs and towels, the energy around the pool stayed fractured. Lighter conversations muted, glances quicker and sharper. Charlene eventually slinked away, head down, practically speed-walking to the parking lot. No grand exit, no parting shot, just the heavy weight of her own shame pressing on her. Dorian remained at his seat, not out of stubbornness, but because he refused to let someone like Charlene dictate the terms of his peace. He had earned the right to sit in the sun without question, and he wasn't giving it up. Greg eventually dragged his chair closer with a grunt. "Mind if I join you, Admiral?" he said, half joking, but with real respect. Dorian chuckled lightly. "Please. And drop the Admiral. Just Dorian now." Greg smiled, leaning back. The two men sat in companionable silence, broken only by the splash of a teenager jumping into the shallow end. After a moment, Greg spoke again, his voice low. "You know, this community needed to see that." Dorian didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head back, letting the sun warm his face. "Maybe," he said finally. "Maybe it'll make someone think twice next time." Greg nodded. "I think it already has." Not long after, the woman with the yoga mat, Selena Vargas, as Dorian would later learn, walked over, setting her mat a few chairs away. "I'm glad you stayed," she said simply. Dorian opened his eyes and smiled. Selena stayed for a moment longer, as if weighing whether to say more, but ultimately just shook her head. "You shouldn't have to explain yourself to anyone," she said. Dorian appreciated that, deeply, but he also knew the world didn't always work the way it should. "You're right," he said. "But sometimes it's not about winning the argument. It's about standing in the truth and letting it speak for itself." Selena nodded slowly, turning his words over in her mind. Across the pool, the group of teenagers, who had clearly been eavesdropping, looked more thoughtful than before. Finally, a tall boy with a mess of curly hair worked up the nerve to call out, "Hey, Mr. Rhee!" Dorian turned, offering a small, easy smile. "Yes?" "Thank you," the boy said, voice cracking slightly with nerves, "for your service and for not losing it on her." A ripple of awkward laughter passed through the group as they shuffled their towels, trying to mask how much the moment had gotten to them. Dorian simply lifted a hand in acknowledgement. "Appreciate that," he said. He could tell, for them, this wasn't just another adult argument. It was a lesson they'd carry with them long after the sunburns faded. Selina eventually gathered her things, offering Dorian one last quiet smile before she left. Greg said his goodbyes too, leaving Dorian alone. But this time the silence wasn't heavy. It was real. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the day settle over him the way he had originally intended. No shouting, no accusations, just the sun, the water, and a peace he'd earned 1,000 times over. Still, he knew the work wasn't finished. Healing a community didn't happen in one afternoon, and change didn't stick unless people carried it forward. Later that evening, after the sun dipped behind the mountains and the desert heat softened, Dorian sat on his back porch, sweet tea in hand, listening to the crickets sing. He thought about the day, the stares, the whispers, the silence that had screamed louder than words. It wasn't the first time he'd been mistaken for something he wasn't, and he knew, painfully, it wouldn't be the last. But something about today felt different. Maybe it was because he'd fought battles most people couldn't even imagine, only to come home and still have to fight for basic respect. Or maybe it was because, for the first time, he wasn't fighting alone. That small crowd by the pool, the jogger, the mom, the teenagers, even security, they had seen it. They had stood, in their own quiet ways, with the truth. And that meant something. Maybe real change didn't start with marches or speeches. Maybe it started right here, in neighborhood pools and backyard patios. One conversation, one hard moment at a time. He set his glass down and looked up at the stars, scattered across the sky, like promises still waiting to be kept. Being seen, being heard, being valued. These weren't privileges, they were rights. Rights no one should have to earn, prove, or fight for. Tomorrow people would slip back into their routines. But Dorian believed today had left a mark, deeper than anyone could see. Maybe Charlene would think before she spoke next time. Maybe those teenagers would carry the memory into adulthood. Maybe neighbors would tell friends, who would tell others. Maybe the world could shift if enough people stayed willing to stand, not with anger, not with violence, but with quiet, unshakable truth. He smiled to himself, a small, tired, but genuine smile. This was his home now, and no one could take that from him. As a soft breeze stirred the desert air around him, Dorian Rhee knew one thing for certain. He belonged exactly where he was. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of quiet victory that mattered most. If you've ever been judged before someone even knew your name, if you've ever had to prove your worth to people who should have welcomed you, remember this: you are not alone. Stand in your truth. Stay calm. Stay strong. And never, ever, let someone else's ignorance define your value. If you believe in standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, share this story. Because real change doesn't start in crowds. It starts in moments, just like this. This version builds up the message cleanly, keeps it emotionally powerful, and ends with a natural call to action, but without sounding preachy or rushed.